In making a three-dimensional paper cut, the first thing I do is choose the drawing I'd like to use as the model. This one was done by my granddaughter and is of my granddaughter, my daughter, and me. So I decided I'd like to just do a three-dimensional paper cutting of my granddaughter. The first thing I do after choosing the artwork is to choose the paper. I tend to just use a drawing paper, though I have done it with many different kinds of paper. As long as it's strong enough to stand up, it's fine for using with this. I cut the paper to size, and I tend to like paper that is not too wide. When you get too wide, the images on the outside tend to flop. So I cut this paper 5 inches by 6 inches, and the height is 6 inches. I use 2 papers. You can use more. Of course, the more you use, the tougher it is to get the tiny details. I line up the papers and fold them in half vertically. I crease them well, and then I sew them together on the center fold. Now I use either plain old white thread, or I use monofilament, which is fishing line, and this is always in abundance at my house, so I prefer this. It slides through the paper easily. It also is relatively invisible once you have sewn it on there. To sew, I use a small running stitch, or not such a small running stitch. It's probably about 1/4 of an inch per stitch, and between each stitch I knot at the bottom, and at the top I make a loop. I leave a loop since most of the time I want these hanging anyway. My next step is then to recreate the drawing on 1/2 of the paper, since this particular one is going to end up being symmetrical. So I will draw half of the drawing on here, and then the other half will just be the symmetrical mirror image of that. You can either freehand it, which is what I do, or you can lay one of the layers of paper on top of the drawing and trace through that. When you're making your 3D paper cut, you're going to draw it symmetrically on the folded paper, with the center of the paper the center of the drawing. I drew it in marker here so you could see basically what the drawing looks like, but of course you would only do it in the lightest of pencil marks so that it won't show up later. When you start cutting, be aware of where you sewed the loop here. You don't want to have to cut too closely to the fold there and accidentally clip off your string. And then at the bottom, be aware of where you put your knot here. In all honesty, this is something that I have quite a few around, and I just sew these up when I'm in the mood and have them around for easy use, so I don't already know where the knot's going to be. You could wait until after you drew it to start sewing up, so you don't have to worry about that. But since I produce a lot of these little pre-sewn papers for my own use, sometimes later I will have to go back and cut off the knot and then knot it up here somewhere. Not a big deal, but it would be easier the other way probably. So the next thing that I'm going to do is to start the cutting process. Now in cutting this piece, there are so few details I could get away with using most any kind of scissors that I had around the house. Children's safety scissors, my big sewing scissors, if you dare use such a thing on paper. I like these Honeybee precision scissors. I think they were made for scrapbooking, and I'm going to use those today. When I get up to the detail, that's when I'm going to get out the X-Acto knife and do some trimming there. So you only need to concentrate really on not cutting up your sewn edge, but go ahead next and cut out the image. If it's a child's drawing and the lines are really simple, it should not take you too long. I've now cut out the simple shape that I started with, and I need to go back and cut out the detail. Now I can either go back and use an X-Acto knife, or if I have some tiny scissors around. These are my shear and schnitte scissors. If you don't have something like that, but you have cuticle scissors, they work just as well, and they're good for getting in the tiny spaces. Also, little embroidery scissors sometimes are very good at cutting in. So I'm just going to cut out a little bit of detail in the negative space, or in the space between the lines here, and also around the eye and the mouth that she has. If you have negative space or the holes, it tends to make the drawing or the cutting look a little more interesting. I finished cutting out the details with the X-Acto knife, and since I am a little frugal with my X-Acto blades, sometimes I use them longer than I should. I did go back in and smooth out any ugly edges with my shear and schnitte or cuticle scissors or embroidery scissors, and just kind of cleaned up some of those edges a bit. I feel that the more negative space, or the more holes or empty areas that you have, the more interesting the piece. So I went back with the hole punch and added some of those. Now if my granddaughter were here, I would have let her do that. I've done this with her before, and she goes hole punch crazy, so I know she would choose to do that if she could. After you've erased the lines and finished all the cutting that you would like to do, then you open the piece back up, opening each section at 90-degree angles, crease it a bit, and then your piece is ready for hanging or for sitting.